In the heart of the 18th century, in the colonies that would later become the United States, something was stirring, a quiet murmur that would grow into an unstoppable force, shifting the course of history. The world was not ready for what was to come, nor could the powers in London fully grasp the depth of dissatisfaction brewing in their distant territories across the Atlantic. But for the colonists, the tension had been growing for decades, a slow boil, pushing them toward decisions that would forever alter their destinies. Life in the American colonies, at first glance, was not much different from anywhere else in the world under British rule. Towns bustled with merchants, artisans, farmers, and families trying to carve out lives for themselves. The British Crown provided protection, an extensive trade network, and a sense of belonging to one of the most powerful empires on Earth. Yet, beneath this veneer of order and prosperity, there was a growing discontent, an invisible force that wove itself through the fabric of colonial life. The colonies were a place of opportunity, but also of imbalance. Taxes decreed by far-off lawmakers who had never set foot in the New World began to gnaw at the people's sense of fairness. Each year, as Parliament passed new levies, the colonists were reminded of their limited representation, their muted voices drowned out by decisions made an ocean away. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, these were not just taxes, they were symbols of control, rules imposed by a government that did not truly understand the daily struggles of those living in the colonies. At first, the colonists grumbled quietly. They wrote letters, formed assemblies, and tried to reason with their governors. But these polite efforts were met with indifference or outright dismissal. A flicker of frustration turned into a spark, igniting conversations in taverns, churches, and public squares. People began to question whether they were truly free under such circumstances. Why should they pay taxes on goods they had no say in? Why should they be subject to laws created without their consent? The answer was simple to many. They shouldn't. In Boston, a city that had become the epicenter of colonial resistance, a sense of defiance took hold. The people there had always been fiercely independent, their livelihoods tied to the bustling trade that ran through their port. But when British ships carrying taxed tea arrived, the mood shifted. This wasn't just about a beverage anymore, it was about principle. A group of men, some of them ordinary workers, others merchants and even professionals, came together one night. Disguised, they crept onto the ships docked in the harbor, their actions swift and purposeful. They seized the tea, thousands of pounds worth, and dumped it into the water. This audacious act, later called the Boston Tea Party, sent ripples across the colonies. The Crown's response was severe. To London, the act was nothing short of rebellion, a slap in the face of royal authority. The government responded by tightening its grip, imposing harsher regulations, and sending more troops to the colonies. For the colonists, the message was clear. They were subjects, not partners, in the eyes of the British Empire. This only fueled the growing sense of resistance, a determination to fight for a different future. Ordinary people, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers began to dream of a world where they could make their own laws, chart their own destiny. The months passed and the mood across the colonies grew tense. Townsfolk began stockpiling goods, farmers whispered in fields, and merchants quietly supported the growing movement. The idea of self-rule was no longer an abstract concept. It had taken root in the hearts of men and women who wanted more than the life they had known under British rule. In Lexington and Concord, the tension reached its peak. Early one morning, as the sun was barely peeking over the horizon, a quiet march of British soldiers moved through the countryside, their red coats bright against the early mist. They were searching for arms, trying to stem the growing resistance before it could fully take hold. But the people of the area had been expecting this. Word had spread quickly through secret networks, and a small group of colonial militiamen, farmers with muskets, gathered in a field. They stood silently, not yet knowing how this moment would define them. When the first shot rang out, no one knew exactly who had fired it, but it echoed through the fields, through the towns, and through history itself. That single shot would later be remembered as the spark that lit the flame. News of the event traveled fast, faster than the British forces could suppress it. Across the colonies, people took up arms, ready to defend their homes and their right to self-governance. It was not an organized force. It was made up of ordinary people, driven by an extraordinary cause. And this cause spread like wildfire, from the streets of Boston to the farms of Virginia, uniting a group of colonies into a single defiant force. But this was not the story of an easy path to freedom. For every victory the colonists celebrated, there were moments of doubt, moments when their very future seemed to hang by a thread. The British were well armed, well trained, and had the resources of an empire behind them. The colonists, on the other hand, were short on supplies, often unsure of their own strength. Yet, they had something powerful on their side, an unshakable belief in the rightness of their cause. In Philadelphia, in a modest building, representatives from the colonies came together to decide their collective future. These men were not radicals by nature, but they had been pushed to the edge. They debated, argued, and agonized over what to do next. Some still hoped for reconciliation with the crown, others spoke of independence. Among them, a young man named Thomas Jefferson sat quietly, but his mind was racing. He had been tasked with putting their aspirations into words. Jefferson's pen gave form to their hopes. In a single document, he laid out the case for their separation from Britain, not just as a political necessity, but as a moral imperative. The words were powerful, echoing the ancient principles of natural rights and liberty that had been whispered for centuries but had never before been given such clear expression. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," he wrote, "that all men are created equal." And with those words, the colonists declared not just their intent, but a new vision for what a nation could be. The Declaration of Independence was signed, and with it, the colonies proclaimed their right to be free and self-governed. But this declaration was not the end of their journey. It was only the beginning. As the ink dried, the real struggle loomed ahead. The British, now fully aware of the colonists' intentions, moved to squash the rebellion. They sent more soldiers, tightened their grip, and tried to sever the growing unity between the colonies. Yet, despite the hardships, the colonists held on, driven by the vision of a new world, free from the tyranny they had known. The struggle was long and grueling, filled with moments of despair and fleeting glimpses of hope. Men and women alike sacrificed much, their homes, their livelihoods, and sometimes even their families. But with each passing day, their determination deepened. They were fighting not just for their present, but for a future they believed in, a future where their children and grandchildren could live free from the shackles of an oppressive power. In the towns and cities, whispers of hope mingled with the hardships of daily life. Merchants smuggled goods to keep the movement alive. Women ran farms and businesses while their husbands were away, and communities came together to support one another in ways they had never imagined. Bonds were forged that transcended regional differences, uniting people from Massachusetts to Georgia in a common cause. As the years went by, the tides slowly shifted. The colonists, once seen as a ragtag group of rebels, began to gain respect on the global stage. Their struggle for self-determination caught the attention of foreign powers, some of whom were eager to see the British humbled. Support arrived from unexpected places, providing the colonists with the resources they so desperately needed. And while the British forces remained formidable, the colonists' resolve only grew stronger. In time, the moment of decision came. On a field far from the halls of Parliament or the streets of London, the British forces faced their greatest test. The colonists, with their newfound allies, stood firm. This was no longer a clash between subjects and rulers. This was about two visions of the future, one rooted in tradition and empire, the other in liberty and self-determination. And in that moment, against all odds, the colonists held their ground. When news of the final British retreat reached the colonies, there was no grand celebration at first. Instead, there was a quiet, almost stunned disbelief. Could it be true? Had they really done it? Slowly, the reality set in. They had, through their determination, their sacrifices, and their unwavering belief in the cause of freedom, they had secured their future. The world had changed. The British Empire, once thought invincible, had been forced to concede to the will of a group of colonies on the far side of the world. And those colonies, now united, would go on to build a new nation, one founded on the principles that had been so boldly declared in Philadelphia. The story of the American Revolution is not just one of conflict, but of an idea. The idea that ordinary people, when united by a common cause, can change the course of history. It is a story of resilience, of standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds, and waiting to see what kind of future this fledgling nation would create for itself. The colonies, now transformed into the United States of America, had earned their independence, but the journey was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with new challenges, both internal and external, and yet there was a sense of pride, of accomplishment, and of cautious optimism. The people had come together to throw off the yoke of a distant monarchy, but now they would have to decide what kind of government, what kind of society they would build in its place. The first challenge was simple, yet monumental: how to unite a collection of former colonies, each with its own customs, economy, and interests, into a single nation. The Continental Congress, which had guided the colonies through the tumult of the Revolution, was not built to govern a nation. It was a temporary assembly, a symbol of unity during a time of crisis. But now, with victory in hand, the colonies, now states, needed something more permanent, something that could handle the complexities of governing such a diverse and sprawling land. In the early years after independence, the states operated under the Articles of Confederation, a loose agreement that allowed them to maintain significant autonomy. Each state had its own government, its own laws, and its own ways of doing things. The national government was weak by design, with no real power to tax or regulate commerce between the states. It was, in many ways, a continuation of the colonial mindset. Each state was fiercely independent, unwilling to cede too much authority to a central power. After all, wasn't that what they had just fought against? But as the years went on, it became clear that this system would not be enough to sustain the new nation. Without a strong central government, the states often quarreled with each other, unable to agree on trade policies, boundaries, or how to handle their debts from the Revolution. The national government, unable to levy taxes, had no way to pay its own bills or support a standing military. The very future of the United States seemed to be in jeopardy, not from an external threat, but from within. It was in this environment of uncertainty that a group of leaders from across the states came together in 1787 to fix what was clearly a broken system. These men, many of whom had been instrumental in the Revolution, were not radicals. They were practical, thoughtful individuals who understood the stakes of the moment. Among them were George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton, men of different backgrounds and temperaments, but united in their desire to save the fledgling republic from dissolving into chaos. What emerged from this gathering in Philadelphia would be one of the most significant documents in human history: the United States Constitution. The Constitution was a remarkable achievement, not just because of its content, but because of the way it balanced competing interests. It created a stronger central government, but one that was carefully limited by checks and balances. It preserved the autonomy of the states, but also ensured that the nation would act as one in matters of common concern. And most importantly, it enshrined the principles of liberty and self-government that had been at the heart of the revolution. The Constitution was not perfect, of course. The men who drafted it were products of their time, and they made compromises that would have far-reaching consequences. The most glaring of these was the issue of slavery, which was left unresolved. The Constitution allowed the practice to continue, even though many of the founders understood that it was fundamentally incompatible with the ideals of liberty and equality they had fought for. This decision would haunt the nation for decades, eventually leading to a deep and painful conflict that would threaten to tear the country apart once again. But for the moment, the Constitution provided a framework for stability, and the new nation began to take shape under its guidelines. In 1789, George Washington, the man who had led the colonies to victory, became the first president of the United States. His leadership in those early years was crucial, as he set precedents for how the executive branch would function and how power would be peacefully transferred. Washington's humility, his willingness to step down after 2 terms, and his refusal to allow the presidency to become a monarchy were vital in cementing the idea of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. As the new government took its first steps, the people of the United States also began to grapple with what it meant to be a citizen of a free nation. The revolution had not just been a fight for independence. It had been a battle of ideas, of philosophy. The concept of rights was now central to the American identity. People believed in the right to speak their minds, to worship as they saw fit, to assemble peacefully, and to be free from unjust rule. These were not just lofty ideals anymore. They were promises enshrined in the Bill of Rights, added to the Constitution to ensure that the government could never trample on the freedoms of its people. Yet, even as these ideals were celebrated, the young nation struggled with the realities of building a society that lived up to them. The rights that had been so eloquently described were not extended to everyone. Native Americans, who had lived on the land long before European settlers arrived, found themselves pushed further and further west as the new nation expanded. Their lands were taken, their cultures disregarded, and their rights trampled as the United States pursued its manifest destiny. Similarly, women who had played significant roles in the revolution, whether by managing farms, sewing uniforms, or even participating in the struggle itself, were largely excluded from the political process. The revolution had been fought in the name of equality, but that equality did not yet extend to half the population. Women were expected to continue in their traditional roles, raising families and maintaining households, with little say in the direction of the new nation. And of course, there was the issue of slavery. In the southern states, where the economy was heavily dependent on agriculture, the institution of slavery remained deeply entrenched. Enslaved people had no rights, no voice, and no hope of freedom under the current system. The contradiction was stark. A nation founded on the principles of liberty was also a nation where thousands of people were held in bondage. This contradiction would fester for decades, becoming an open wound that would eventually force the country to confront its darkest truths. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the United States began to grow in both size and ambition. The revolution had unleashed a spirit of possibility, a belief that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. This spirit drove the nation westward as pioneers moved beyond the original 13 states in search of new land and new opportunities. The Louisiana Purchase, completed in 1803, doubled the size of the country almost overnight, providing vast new territories for settlement and exploration. But this expansion was not without its challenges. As the country grew, so too did the divisions within it. The northern states, with their growing industries and cities, began to look very different from the agrarian South. These differences were not just economic, they were cultural and political as well. Debates over the future of slavery, the role of government, and the direction of the country became more intense with each passing year. The revolution had united the colonies, but it had not erased the differences between them. Despite these challenges, the United States continued to push forward, its people driven by a sense of destiny and purpose. The revolution had not just created a new nation, it had created a new way of thinking about what was possible. The idea that people could govern themselves, that they could create a society based on freedom and equality, was a radical notion in the 18th century. And yet, here it was, alive and growing in the hearts and minds of a new generation of Americans. The legacy of the American Revolution is one of both triumph and contradiction. It is the story of a people who stood up against tyranny, who believed in the power of their ideas, and who were willing to sacrifice everything for a chance at a better future. But it is also the story of a nation that struggled to live up to its own ideals, that wrestled with the complexities of freedom and the realities of inequality. In the years since the Revolution, the United States has continued to evolve, sometimes painfully, sometimes triumphantly, but always with an eye toward the principles that were laid down during those tumultuous years of rebellion. The idea that all people are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. These are the ideas that continue to shape the American experiment. As we look back on the American Revolution, it is important to remember that it was not just a single event, but the beginning of an ongoing journey. The revolution did not end with the signing of the Declaration of Independence or the defeat of British forces. It was the beginning of a much longer and more complicated story, one that continues to unfold to this day. For the men and women who lived through those years, the revolution was a moment of great uncertainty and great hope. They could not have known what the future held, whether their bold experiment in self-government would succeed or fail.